So before we get ahead and start developing some of the outputs like our color and our roughness, I want to take a look at completing the height map for the foliage and give you some ideas on how you could go about creating foliage for really any material that you'd want. I'll come up over here where we've got some more space, and I'm going to add a shape node. And with this node, I'm going to want to use a paraboloid, right, to get some soft fall off, but we're going to manipulate it a little bit because, by default, it's not going to look too much like a blade of grass or a leaf or really any kind of foliage out there. So I'm going to come into the size here, and on the X, I'm going to change it down to be something like 0.9, just so it's off the sides there. And I'm going to bring the Y up, so the vertical factor of it, to something like 1.8. So you can see that it's going to, if we hit spacebar, kind of tile off our texture map here. So I'm also going to bring the scale down to something like 0.6. And actually, maybe I'll bring it up to something like 0.65. So we're going to get a little bit of overlap, but with what we're going to be doing to this, we're going to be able to get rid of those. So now that I've got this shape defined, I want to go ahead and start kind of carving out some areas to make it more leaf-like, right? So it kind of comes to a point. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add another shape. And I'm going to switch the pattern again to be paraboloid. But this time I'm going to switch the Y value to be 4 so that we're getting it pretty much tiling vertically. And I'm going to switch the X to be about 0.6 so that we're getting this kind of soft fall off there. I'm now going to add a transformation 2D node, and this is going to allow me to start to move it around and manipulate it and rotate it and do pretty much whatever I want with it. So I can go ahead and add a blend mode between these two and plug this guy in. And I'm going to want to use a subtract blending mode, right? Because I want to get rid of pretty much using this as a subtractor, so all the white values. So we can see that as I double click on that, right, maybe hold down shift to give it a snap rotation there, right? I'm going to kind of want to line it up a little bit like this. So that if we take a look, right, we're going to get it kind of falling off like that way. And ideally, I'd like to mirror this across the X here. So with our transformation 2D, that's not really going to work. It's going to tile like this. So what we can use, if we want to mirror the effect right down the middle, there's actually a node that's going to allow us to do that, being the mirror grayscale. So now when I have this selected, right, you can see that it's tiled anything on the left side across the X there. We also have the ability to mirror it across the Y, but that's not going to produce the result that I want, so I'm going to leave it on X. Now if we take a look at our blend here, and we can kind of play around with this value there, maybe get something kind of like that, where it's just kind of coming down into a point. That's starting to look pretty good, and hopefully you can see it's resembling a little bit more like a leaf. So with this, I want to go ahead and first just add a blur high quality grayscale, right? Blur things out just a little bit more. So I'll bring the quality up. I'm going to bring this down to about, we'll try 1.5. And that's looking okay, actually. That's looking pretty soft. So now for the leaf, I want to be able to give it that kind of middle section there, right? Where the stem kind of permeates through the entire leaf. And then we'll have some kind of fall off on the kind of both sides of our leaf there. So to first start that, I'm going to just add another blend so that we're going to be able to see it. And for this, I'm going to use a gradient 3 node, or a gradient linear 3, I should say. And you can see that we've got this white line down the center there, and it falls off into black on both sides. So I can actually go ahead and rotate this 90 degrees so that we're going to get this vertical, right? And then I'm going to use the subtract blending mode, again, to use this middle piece there to subtract from the value of our leaf. Now, by default, it's a little bit harsh. So I'm going to do something like 0.4, right? It's going to give us just kind of that, the indication or the idea that it's there. But I'm also going to use a curve node to help me refine that gradient. So if we take a look at our blend here and come back to our curve, I just pull this kind of down and out a little bit, right? It's going to help sharpen things up just a touch. And so that's looking pretty sweet. And finally, I want to give this just an overall gradient pass so that we're kind of getting more fall off on the top here as well as the bottom. So again, I'll add another blend node, bring this guy out, and instead of a gradient linear 3, I'm instead going to use a gradient linear 1. And it's just going to give us a black to white value there. And if I plug these in, again using the subtract blending mode, you can see kind of what it's going to do, right? Is in the wider areas, right, get rid of those, and in the darker areas, just kind of keep them. However, like our gradient over here, I'm going to want to use another curve just so that I can fine tune it and develop it more like how I want it to look. So with our curve here, I'm actually going to add a point right in the center there, and I'm going to bring this dark value up just a little bit because I want to kind of subtract down here just a touch, but not obviously to the point where there's literally nothing there. Now if I take this middle point and bring this down, kind of round it out a little bit, that's going to allow us to keep a lot of the center area, right? The darker areas, because white is the subtraction value where this is darker, so it's not going to subtract. And maybe if I bring this down just a little bit, we're going to get some of that showing up again. Now I might want to just kind of do something just like that. Maybe even bring in the handles just a little bit, just to kind of get a shape nice and soft and kind of like a round off. And now that we've gone ahead and created what I'm going to consider the base shape for our leaf, I want to go in and start adding some more characteristics such as kind of those wavy vein patterns that you would see on a leaf. Now most of the foliage for this particular material is going to be a lot smaller, so we're not going to really get in and refine too much for these, but it's going to allow us to convey the general idea and also use it in later maps when we want to look at the ambient occlusion or the albedo or the roughness. So to start that off, I'm also going to use another gradient map, and this time it's going to be the gradient linear 2. And the reason I'm going to use this, you can see, is that it's kind of just got a nice rounded fall off pretty much through and through. If we take a look, right, we can see that as we tile it, it's going to just have this nice darker value with, like I said, just a nice round soft fall off. I'll bring this over here and we'll add another blend. And we can just plug that right in. So I'm going to switch the gradient linear to be probably around 9 or 10 tiles there, something like that, where it's just tiling vertically and horizontally. And now I want to give some waviness to this overall design. So I'll add a directional warp. And again, using a Gaussian noise as our input here. Just bring that down. We can see that we're really not going to get a whole lot of warping going on. But I'm going to bring the scale down just to make it a little bit larger. Something maybe around 10. I'll also increase the intensity up to something like maybe 15. And if I play around with the warp direction, right, now we're going to be able to start seeing some of that warping. So maybe something, let's try 25. How does that look? 25 doesn't look too bad. We can play around with the scale too. Maybe do something like 8. I don't want it to be too noisy, but I want to give the idea that there's some organicness to it. And now I want to rotate it in the direction of the leaf, right? Because I don't want it just tiling straight across. That's going to look very bland. And so instead what I'm going to do is add a transform. And like we did way back at the start here, I'm also going to add another mirror grayscale because I want this to essentially mirror across our geometry. So add another mirror. And also come into the blend mode, and I want to change the blend mode to be multiply here, right? So that we're going to kind of keep the dark values, but get rid of any of the lighter values. And maybe bring the opacity down to something like, let's try 0.15. And that's looking pretty good. But you can see, right, we're getting that issue of it just kind of straight across, which doesn't really look too hot. So instead, what I'm going to do is just kind of rotate it downwards so that it follows the general direction of kind of the leaf, right? Or it works perpendicular to the tapering effect of the leaf. So you can get something like that. We can also go and change with the number of tiles, right? If we want it to be bigger or smaller. And the warping intensity as well. Maybe I'll do actually something like 40, just because I find it gives a nice, more rounded effect. Now that we've got that all out of the way, I want to go and just start warping the actual leaf itself because it's a little too straight, a little too perfect. And that's going to be pretty easy to do. I'm just going to use a warp. And I'm going to steal this Gaussian noise over here and just use that as our warping intensity here. So maybe bring the intensity down just a little bit to something like, well, we can do 0.5, right? Very subtle, but it's going to make the difference. And finally, I'm going to use a transformation 2D node just to bring it up so that it's more towards the center of our texture set there, right? We can see that it's kind of lumped down just a little bit towards the bottom there. And we can also go ahead and holding down Control and scaling this outwards. And actually I'll hold down Control Shift while I scale it outwards just to bring it up a little bit so that we're trying to maximize the amount of space that it's actually taking up here. I'll maybe bring this back up just a touch. Now finally here comes the part where we get to do a little bit more creative design with the particular leaves. So I've gone ahead and created just this one foliage asset or kind of foliage height map. But with this one particular design, we're going to be able to really get a whole range of different designs and looks just by playing with a few parameters on 1 or 2 nodes. So the node that I'm going to first look at is going to be the splatter circular node. And this node is going to allow us to kind of do what the name suggests and splatter this particular height map around in a circle. So I'll bring this out and add a splatter circular node. And by default, it's going to plug this into the background. We don't actually want it to be the background. We want it to be pattern input. So now with this guy here, I'll go and switch the pattern to be image input, right? And we're going to get our height map, our leaf, showing up. So I'm going to change the pattern to be around 16. So we're going to get a lot of leaves in a circle here. And I also want to just kind of change the randomness of it so that it's kind of random as to the number that are actually showing up. I'm also going to add on our ring amount here. So you can see that if I increase this up to 2, it's going to add a random amount in the center there. And we can really have virtually limitless number of leaves, right? And get some really cool designs this way. But I'm just going to go and do 2 for this particular asset. And as I scroll down, I'm going to find radius. And for our radius, I'm going to use 0.2, right? Just to bring it in and tighten it up a little bit. And that's all I really want to use for our position. Now, these are looking a little bit small, so I want to make sure that I can scale these up so that we're getting a good resolution for our height map before we start and add it all over our material here. So on the X size here, I'm going to bring it down to 0.05. because I want them to be a little bit slimmer, and I'll leave it at 0.1 on the Y. I'll also bring the size random up for the X to 0.2, just to add some variation. And on the Y, I'm also going to add a 0.1. Again, nothing crazy, but a little bit of variation helps. Now for the scale, I'm actually going to scale these up to something like 5, right, to really get this big kind of crazy looking design here. And that's starting to look really cool. We can also play around with the scale random, maybe something like 0.2. And I might want to come back up just to where we have pattern amount random and just kind of increase this up a little bit, just so it's not as noisy. So maybe something like 0.6. So we're getting some really cool designs there. So pretty easily, you can see that we can get a really, nice looking foliage piece, kind of like a weed or a flower or the base of some kind of plant. And these are all using the same height map information that we created, relatively easily. So I'm going to duplicate this guy here because I want to add kind of another circular design like this. But this time I'm going to just use 8. I'm going to bring the pattern amount random down to 0 there. Actually, you know what? I'll bring this up maybe something like 0.2. Now I want to go ahead and change this overall size. I'm okay with the radius, but I want to change the size of these leaves just to give it a different look. So for the X, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 0.1, make them a little bit fatter, and I'm going to leave the Y. I'm also okay with the size random here, and I'm going to leave the scale on 5 too. Now what I'm going to do is actually come back up as well, and I don't want to have this kind of center ring there. So I'm going to just change the ring amount back down to 1. So it's going to just kind of get this fall off down into the center here. And this is going to be where you would consider kind of the roots of this foliage to be. And so very easily, with only changing a few parameters, we've got 2 very different looking foliage, which is really, really cool and really powerful. The final piece that I want to make is I'm just going to drag this out and add another transformation 2D. And instead what I'm going to do is just scale this guy inwards, holding down Control, just to make it a little thinner. Now I want to get rid of the tiling though. So in our tiling mode here, I'll select Absolute and no tiling. And just like that, we have 3 really nice looking height maps that we're going to be able to use to create a whole whack load of variation in our foliage. So now that we have the designs for the heights of these foliage pieces, we need to go ahead and start to blend them back into our material and have them kind of conform to the overall shapes and height map that we've already established for this particular material. So a really great node that we can use to do this is the shape splatter node. So if I type in shape, start to type in splatter, you can see that kind of like the flood fill node, we're going to get the shape splatter, but then we're going to get a lot of different shape splatter extras. So we're going to be using the shape splatter to mask later on. But to start off, we're going to need to use the shape splatter node. So you can see it kind of looks like the tile sampler node, one of those big nodes that come in. And it has a lot of different inputs and a couple different outputs too, which really don't make sense right now, but we'll see those in another video. So by default, we're only going to have access to 1 pattern. But if I come into the node and under pattern, you can see that pattern input number, we can swap this up to 3. So that now we're going to be able to accept 3 different patterns here. And if we take a look, we can see all of our different foliage showing up in our 2D view here. So how do we actually go about connecting this to our other height information here? Well, we have this background height node. So if I take this and I plug this into our height blend, you can see that now we're going to get our height information showing up underneath, and it's going to use all of our foliage and kind of actually conform it a little bit to the height information. Now what I'll do is just shift and steal this again so that we have this as our most updated output. I'm also going to just add a connection here so that we, keep things nice and clean. It's better to organize as you go. And so now if we take a look, we can see that all of our foliage is starting to show up over top of our rocks. And so that's looking pretty sweet. But it's really, looking a little uniform. Everything is vertically, nice and straight. Horizontally, it's nice and tiled. So we're going to have to do a little bit of work still. The first thing I want to do is change the X and the Y amount. So I'm going to do 100 by 100. And it's really, really going to make things super duper small. Now we're not going to keep them that small, but we want to get a lot of them in so that we can start manipulating them. So I'm going to come back down to size, and the first parameter I'm going to change is scale. And I'm going to bring this up to 5. Now it's kind of looking like everything's just made out of leaves, which is pretty sweet, right? We've increased the size again. If we take a look, we can see we're getting some pretty decent resolution, right? We're going to be able to see some of the folds of the faces of the leaves and so on and so forth. So that's looking pretty sweet. I'm also going to increase the scale random up to be something like 0.5, just to add some variation to these leaves. And that's about it for our scale. I'm also going to change our position random all the way up, as well as our rotation random, so that everything is just kind of facing in pretty random positions. So that's starting to look a lot better now with our leaves. But now we need to think about actually blending it in so that it fits and conforms well with our height map. So all of those options are going to be down underneath the height setting here. So for the height offset, I'm going to set this to 0.5, and it's really not going to do too much visibly on our mesh here because we've cut the leaves pretty much everywhere. But it's going to essentially give our leaves a little bit of a height offset so that it looks like they're actually 3D objects instead of just kind of smoothed into the faces of the rocks. I'm also going to come down to where it says conform to background. And if we read the tooltip here, essentially what it's going to allow us to do is kind of conform these leaves to whatever the background height information is. So essentially these rocks and this dirt. So if we go ahead and increase this up, ideally we're going to be able to see more of the rock height information. And it kind of looks like these leaves are somewhat plastered onto these rocks. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring that all the way up. And I'm also going to bring our smooth all the way up to 1 as well, just to help smooth things out a little bit. All right, so now really all it looks like is we've just plastered leaves onto our height map, and things aren't really looking too hot. They're looking cool, but they're not looking too hot. So how do we go about getting rid of these leaves? Well, we can see down at the bottom here, we're going to have this mask random, right? So if I bring this up to something like, we'll say 0.6, right? It's gotten rid of a lot of the leaves, but there's really is still a ton of leaves, and I don't necessarily want all the leaves to be on the rocks. I want to be able to see a lot of the rocks too. So how can we kind of go ahead and mask out the rocks themselves? Well, we're going to have this mask random input here, which is going to allow us to input a mask so that we can actually use a map multiplier to multiply this mask random. So if we take a look, right, I'll just select this guy here. We're going to be able to come back to our height blend and plug this in, because what this height mask is going to give us is essentially a binary mask between the blend of our background dirt and our rocks. So this is a very handy, very useful tool to have because it's going to give us access to this nice mask here. So now what I'll do is if I come in here and scroll all the way back down to the bottom where we have our masks, if I start to use this mask here, I'll bring that all the way up and you can see, oh cool, it did pretty much the complete opposite of what I wanted, and it started to mask out the dirt and not the rocks. So what we'll have to do with this mask is we'll just have to quickly add an invert grayscale so that we're telling it, no, we don't want you to mask off the dirt, we want you to actually mask off the rocks here. You can see very quickly that's gone ahead and pretty much removed most of the leaves from all the rocks. So that's looking pretty cool. Now I'll come back down and we also have this third option in our masking, and this is the mask from background slope. So it's going to take into consideration the actual slope of whatever the leaf is resting on and determine whether or not it's actually suitable for a shape to be splattered on there. So we're kind of developing a threshold with this. So if I bring this up, we're going to see a lot of them start to disappear. And there's only going to be a couple left behind. Already that's starting to look pretty cool, and now it's a matter of discretion for your particular material whether or not you want more or less leaves. I think I may go ahead and just bring this down to something like 0.35, just so that we're able to keep some leaves in there. And so now at the end of the day, I've decided I'm going to use a mask random of about 0.1. And this is going to give me a lot of nice looking foliage, some on the rocks, but a lot of it also in between our rocks there. So hopefully this video has given you some ideas on how you can go about developing foliage for obviously this material, but ideally any other material that you're going to be working with. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at developing our albedo map so that we're going to be able to introduce some color and some extra surface information to this material.